Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are taking a giant leap back in time, really far back, to tackle maybe the most fundamental question in North American archaeology. Who were the first people here?
And crucially, when did they arrive?
Exactly. It's a puzzle, right? Defined
Yeah.
by bits of stone and, well, layers of sand.
It really is. And it's a puzzle that forced, an entire scientific community to basically scrap their favorite textbook answer. So our mission today is to unpack the evidence from Cactus Hill.
That's the archaeological site in Virginia.
That's the one. It became this crucial battleground, started tearing holes in that traditional timeline, and really compelling researchers to fundamentally rethink how the continent was colonized.
Okay, so before Cactus Hill shook things up, let's set the stage. What was the story everyone believed? The Clovis first hypothesis.
Right. Clovis first.
Right.
If you were a serious archaeologist, say for most of the 20th century, this was the accepted wisdom.
And what did it say?
Well, it believed in simplicity and speed. The
Yeah.
view was that the first widespread inhabitants were the Clovis people, associated with those distinctive fluted spear points.
And they arrived around?
Around 13,500 years ago, the story went that they walked from Siberia across the Bering Land Bridge, Beringia, and then, this is the key part, they had to wait.
Wait for what?
For an ice-free corridor to open up between the massive continental ice sheets. The thinking was this corridor became passable maybe between 14,500 and 14,000 years ago, letting them finally pour south. It was a neat, elegant theory.
Very neat. Almost too neat, maybe. Because sites started cropping up that just didn't fit. Older sites.
Exactly. And one of the most persistent challengers, especially on the East Coast, was Cactus Hill. Its official designation is 44 SX202, right there in the Nottoway River in Virginia.
Okay, so Cactus Hill enters the scene.
And that's where the trouble, or maybe the excitement, really started. Cactus Hill is what archaeologists call a multi-component site.
Meaning lots of different layers of occupation over time.
Precisely. It has clear later layers from the Archaic period, and also layers with those classic Clovis points. But the bombshell, the really explosive evidence, lay below the Clovis layer.
Below Clovis.
Way below. Excavators found what they proposed was a pre-Clovis occupation. And it was separated from the Clovis stuff by what they saw as an absolute archaeological seal.
The seal, what kind?
A thin band of sterile sand. Sand with no artifacts in it.
Okay, let's dig into that sterile sand layer because I imagine everything hinges on whether that separation is real, right? How clear was it, and what did the dates from below it say?
You're right, that's the crux of the controversy. The excavators reported this crucial layer of clean, sterile sand was, well, it varied in thickness, maybe 7 to 20 centimeters.
So a few inches.
Yeah, about 3 to 8 inches. If that layer was truly intact, it meant the culture underneath it had absolutely nothing to do with the Clovis people who came later.
All right.
And the dates?
Yeah.
The dates from that lower level were just staggering for the time.
How staggering?
Radiocarbon dates, these were on bits of wood charcoal found in that lowest level. They ranged from about 15,000 up to 18,250 radiocarbon years ago. Now, when you calibrate that...
To get calendar years.
Right, you calibrate it, and you're looking at an incredible range of maybe 18,200 to 22,000 years ago.
Wow. Okay, let's just pause on that. 22,000 years ago. That's pushing human presence in Virginia back by almost 10,000 years compared to Clovis. How did they even process that?
It was revolutionary. I mean, think about it. That time difference alone is longer than all of recorded human history. So, yeah, reconciling stone tools being that old, especially way out east in Virginia, was a massive challenge.
So what did the tools look like? They couldn't have been Clovis points, right?
Definitely not Clovis. They were unique. The assemblage in that lowest level, it included a lot of quartzite blades, these small sort of polyhedral cores they napped from, long blade-like flakes. And the most distinctive tools were these finely worked points they called Cactus Hill points.
Cactus Hill points. Describe them.
They're pretty small. They have concave bases, parallel sides, and they were made using pressure flaking. Just a totally different look and technology compared to the big fluted Clovis points found higher up in the site.
Okay, so the excavating team felt they had it. The physical separation with the sand layer, these incredibly early dates, and unique non-Clovis tools beneath it all. But, there was skepticism. Huge skepticism, I bet.
Oh, absolutely. The Clovis first model was deeply entrenched.
So how did the original teams defend the site? What was their argument for its integrity? How did they try to convince everyone that these old artifacts weren't just, younger stuff that somehow tumbled down?
They knew they'd face scrutiny, so they mounted a really detailed multidisciplinary defense. They presented, I think it was 11 different lines of corroborating evidence.
It's 11, okay.
Yeah, trying to show the site was solid. We can kind of group their defense into maybe three main pillars. First, you have the chronology and artifacts.
The dates and the tools themselves.
Right. Consistent dates from different methods. They used both radiocarbon and luminescence dating. Plus, as we said, the artifacts themselves were typologically consistent within that lower level and distinct from Clovis. That points to a different cultural group.
Okay, that's pillar one. What were the other two? The geological proof.
That's maybe the most critical part, stratigraphy and context. This is about the layers themselves. They emphasized finding things like cross-mended artifacts.
Pieces that fit back together.
Exactly. Finding broken pieces of the same tool within a specific layer, not scattered vertically. That strongly suggests those layers were intact living surfaces where things were dropped and broken, not mixed up later.
And the third pillar.
That involves soil science. They look at soil chemistry and microremains. Specifically, they found consistent soil chemistry patterns like elevated phosphorus levels often associated with human occupation that lined up with the artifact layers. And they also looked at phytoliths. These are microscopic plant silica remains, and their distribution also supported discrete, separate human occupations in those specific layers. Their argument was basically, look, it's statistically almost impossible for all these independent lines of evidence, the dates, the distinct tools, the crossmends, the soil chemistry, the phytoliths, to all be wrong or corrupted in the exact same way.
That sounds like a pretty robust defense, a multi-pronged approach. So why does Cactus Hill still remain controversial for some? Where did later critics find a potential weakness?
The main skepticism, and it persists, really comes down to the site's geology. Cactus Hill is located in what are essentially ancient sand dunes. They're Aeolian deposits.
Meaning wind-deposited sand.
Exactly. And that kind of sandy environment is notoriously susceptible to disturbances after the artifacts were deposited. The big culprit they point to is bioturbation.
Right, you mentioned that. Explain bioturbation for us again.
It's basically anything living that messes with the soil layers. Burrowing animals are a big one. Gophers, insects, worms, even tree roots growing down and decaying. Over thousands of years, these actions can subtly, or not so subtly, move smaller artifacts up and down through the sandy layers.
So the critics argue that maybe some of those supposedly pre-Clovis artifacts were actually younger, maybe Clovis era, or even later, and they just got dragged down into the older sand by a gopher or something.
That's the core of the critique. Since the sediment is fine sand, it's relatively easy for things to move vertically. They also point out that some other dating methods used at the site, particularly some optically stimulated luminescence or OSL dates, returned much younger ages, sometimes closer to 10,000 years ago, muddying the waters a bit.
Okay, so the debate becomes about the physical integrity of those layers. And this is where some researchers brought in a new tool, right? It's a statistical method.
Yeah, trying to quantify the mixing. They use something called the Apparent Stratigraphic Integrity Index, or ASI.
ASI, how does that work? How does it test if a site's layers are jumbled?
It's pretty clever, actually. The ASI basically measures how cleanly the artifact counts drop off as you dig down through the excavation levels. Imagine a perfectly layered cake artifacts are dense in one layer, then boom, nothing in the sterile layer below. That site would have a very high ASI score, close to 1.
Okay, perfect separation equals high score.
Right. But if the artifacts gradually decrease with depth, kind of trailing off into lower levels instead of stopping abruptly, that suggests mixing has occurred, like stirring the layers together. That gives you a low ASI score.
So they ran this ASI analysis on Cactus Hill and other sites. What did they find?
The results were, well, they definitely fueled the skepticism. They found that known, secure sites, like ones up in Beringia north of the ice sheets, and really solid Clovis sites south of the ice, like Shawnee-Minisink in Pennsylvania, showed high integrity. Shawnee-Minisink had an ASI around 0.676. Pretty good separation.
And the controversial sites, like Cactus Hill.
They showed patterns suggesting significant mixing. Cactus Hill, along with other disputed southern pre-Clovis sites like Cooper's Ferry in Idaho and the Deborel-Friedkin site in Texas, they all displayed low ASI values. We're talking between 0.156 and 0.309.
Much lower. So the statistics seem to back up the bioturbation concerns.
That was the interpretation. The low ASI scores suggested that the artifact distribution wasn't sharply defined by layer, but rather showed a gradual decline with depth. This pattern looks like vertical smearing, potentially explaining how younger artifacts might have ended up mixed into older sediment contexts.
It's fascinating, though, because even with these integrity questions about Cactus Hill specifically, the site, combined with others, still played a huge role, didn't it?
Absolutely. You can debate the specifics of Cactus Hill's lowest layer, but the sheer audacity of its claimed dates, alongside other sites like Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania, which also has very old dates, and especially the really secure, undisputed dating of Monte Verde down in Chile.
Monte Verde is the big one, right? Dated way back.
Yeah, Monte Verde is now securely dated to 14,800 years ago. Undisputed. That site alone basically broke the Clovis first model. So Cactus Hill was part of this wave of evidence that forced the entire paradigm to shatter.
So the conversation shifted.
Completely. The question for archaeologists is no longer if people were here before Clovis. That's pretty much accepted now. The questions are, when did the first people arrive and how did they get here? The old model, relying on that late opening ice-free corridor, just doesn't work anymore.
Okay, so if Clovis first is out, what filled the gap? There are two main competing ideas now, right?
Pretty much. Two major alternative theories for the initial peopling.
Let's start with the one that seemed to have the most momentum currently, the Pacific Route, sometimes called the Kelp Highway.
Yeah, the Kelp Highway theory. It's gained a lot of traction, and I think it's appealing because it's so practical, ecologically speaking.
How does it work?
It suggests people didn't wait for the ice sheets to part inland. Instead, they arrived much earlier, maybe 15,000 to 16,000 years ago, possibly even earlier, by boat. They traveled down the Pacific coast, skirting the edge of the massive continental glaciers.
Using coastal resources.
Exactly. The idea is they utilize the rich marine resources found in coastal kelp forests, fish, shellfish, marine mammals, seabirds. This kelp highway could have provided food and refuge along the entire route, allowing them to bypass the huge, inhospitable ice sheets covering most of Canada.
And is there solid evidence backing this up? Genetic or archaeological?
There is, and it's growing. DNA evidence from indigenous populations across the Americas increasingly supports a model with a single pre-Clovis origin population that likely dispersed down the coast.
And actual sites.
Archaeologically, we have some really compelling sites. Paisley Caves in Oregon yielded human coprolites, fossilized feces with human DNA dating back over 14,000 years. And maybe even more critical is the Page-Latson site in Florida.
Florida. That's a long way from the Pacific.
It is, but what they found there, underwater in a sinkhole, was a mastodon tusk with very clear-cut marks from stone tools. And it was found in a sealed, undisturbed layer dated securely to 14,550 years ago. That's evidence of people butchering megafauna well before Clovis, and potentially consistent with an early coastal arrival spreading across the continent.
And this coastal route idea also helps explain some weirdness in the tool types.
Right.
Like, not everything looks like it evolved into Clovis.
Exactly right. We see different stone tool traditions popping up that don't seem related to Clovis. A great example is the technology found on the Channel Islands off California, part of the Western stemmed tradition. These points look very different from Clovis points.
So maybe multiple groups.
It strongly suggests that the peopling wasn't just one single migration event. It was likely earlier, perhaps involved multiple groups, maybe arriving via different routes or at slightly different times, and bringing distinct cultural toolkits. The existence of both Clovis and Western-stemmed traditions around the same time really points to a more complex picture than Clovis first ever allowed.
Okay, so that's the Kelp Highway. What's the other major theory? This one sounds way more out there. The Atlantic route. The Solutrean Hypothesis.
Ah, yes, the Solutrean Hypothesis. This one is definitely more controversial, though it captured a lot of public and some academic attention, especially in the early 2000s. It was partly inspired by finding these potentially very early sites like Cactus Hill on the East Coast.
Who proposed it, and what's the core idea?
It was championed primarily by Smithsonian archaeologists Dennis Stanford and Bruce Bradley. And the idea is, well, epic. It suggests that people from the Solutrean culture, who lived in Ice Age France and Spain roughly 24,000 to 17,000 years ago, didn't migrate east or south. They migrated west.
West. Across the Atlantic, during the Ice Age.
Across the North Atlantic pack ice, yes. During the last glacial maximum, when sea levels were much lower and the winter sea ice extended much further south. The hypothesis is that these Solutrean hunters adapted to exploiting marine resources along the ice edge, essentially followed that edge across the Atlantic and became the ancestors of Clovis people in North America.
Wow. Okay, that's a journey. What possible evidence could support such an incredible claim, linking Ice Age Europeans to first Americans?
Their argument hinges less on geographic plausibility, which is obviously a huge hurdle, and more on technological similarity. Specifically, the sophisticated techniques used to make the beautiful, thin, symmetrical Solutrean laurel leaf points.
What about them?
Stanford and Bradley argued that the complex manufacturing process, particularly a technique called overshot flaking, used to thin the points, is virtually identical to techniques used to make some pre-Clovis and Clovis points in North America. They argued this specific high-level technological signature is too complex and too similar to have been invented independently by two different cultures separated by an ocean. It had to be transmitted.
Technological transfer across the Atlantic ice. And didn't they point to some specific artifacts found on the U.S. East Coast?
They did. These are controversial finds, but highly suggestive if you accept the premise. One key piece is the Sinmar biface. It's a laurel leaf-shaped point, very Solutrean-like in appearance, that was dredged up by a scallop boat off the coast of Virginia.
Near Cactus Hill.
Relatively near, yes. And it was dredged up along with mastodon remains that were dated to nearly 23,000 years ago. Another find is a potential Solutrean-style laurel leaf point found at Ep12, also in Virginia, that was claimed to be made of actual French flint.
French flint in Virginia.
That was the claim. So these specific finds, located geographically near other early sites like Cactus Hill and temporally kind of fitting the Solutrean window, were used to bolster the argument for an Atlantic crossing.
But the mainstream archaeological community, it's fair to say, remains deeply skeptical of the Solutrean hypothesis.
Right. Overwhelmingly skeptical, yes. While the technological similarities are intriguing, most archaeologists see them not as proof of migration, but as an example of technological convergence or parallelism.
Meaning different people independently figuring out similar solutions to similar problems.
Exactly. Similar ways to make thin, effective stone points from similar raw materials. Critics also point to the huge geographic gap, the lack of any Solutrean sites in between French Spain and the East Coast, the significant time gap, about 5,000 years, between the end of Solutrean culture and the beginning of Clovis culture, and, crucially, the complete absence of any direct evidence for such a journey. No boats, no campsites on the supposed ice bridge, nothing concrete.
So it's an idea based mainly on comparing tool shapes and manufacturing techniques across vast distances and time gaps.
Pretty much. Compared to the growing genetic and archaeological evidence for the Kelp Highway route down the Pacific, the Solutrean hypothesis lacks broad support.
Okay, so stepping back, we've gone from the simple Clovis first idea through the challenge posed by sites like Cactus Hill to these two major competing narratives now. The Pacific Kelp Highway, which seems more likely.
Currently favored, yeah.
And the much more debated Atlantic Solutrean route. But the common thread seems to be that the old timeline is broken.
Definitely. The dogmatic certainty of Clovis first is gone. The conversation now is much more nuanced. It's not if people were here before Clovis, but refining when they first arrived, how many migration waves there might have been and how these different groups, Pacific coasters, maybe others, interacted across the continent.
So bringing it all back to Cactus Hill one last time, even with the ongoing arguments about its perfect integrity, about that statistical smearing in the layers, what's its lasting contribution? Why do we still talk about it?
Cactus Hill was absolutely pivotal. Even if you question the lowest levels, its existence and the dates proposed stimulated so much new research and, importantly, helped break that Clovis psychological barrier. It documented a long, layered sequence of human occupation in one spot on the East Coast. And crucially, it provided what you might call a chronological niche.
A niche for what?
For those unique non-Clovis point types, like the Cactus Hill points themselves. Finding them below Clovis, even if the context is debated, gave archaeologists context for similar points found elsewhere, maybe just lying on the surface or in disturbed sites. It suggested these weren't just oddities, they might represent a real, earlier technological phase. It showed that the earliest occupants in the Nottoway River Valley weren't just barely surviving pioneers.
They were established.
Exactly. The evidence suggested they were already established hunter-gatherers in that region, comfortable, using a distinct toolkit well before Clovis times. Cactus Hill gave us a glimpse, however debated, of a pre-Clovis presence, not just a first arrival.
It wasn't necessarily step 1, but maybe step 5 or 10 in the process.
Precisely. That's a good way to put it.
Okay, so to leave our listeners with a final thought, the original excavators of Cactus Hill themselves, even with their potentially groundbreaking early dates, concluded that their site probably isn't the oldest human site in the Americas. Given everything we've discussed, the debates about site integrity like at Cactus Hill, the growing evidence for the Kelp Highway, new finds possibly emerging from Beringia, where do you think the oldest, truly unambiguous evidence of humans in the Americas will eventually be found? Will it be deep in a cave somewhere, along an ancient coastline now underwater? Or maybe somewhere completely unexpected we haven't even started looking yet?